Greetings, fencers. So today we're going to look at our steel sabers. So the first saber we'll look at is the Cold Steel Hutton saber, and it is not a good saber. There's really no other way to put it. It is really floppy, and often cuts just turn to the flat because it flops down to one side, and this happens very consistently to where it just always picks a side and spins in your hand. The handle is really thin and uncomfortable. So this, when I actually disassembled it and I tightened the nut back on, it snapped it. So it's half the tang and then another half or third is the screw, and it just broke right at the halfway point. So yeah, the tip is also not very blunted, it's not thick. It does need a tip in order to be used safely, and the edges are pretty thin, so this would actually cut gloves, cut jacket, thread, and lots of stuff. It does have to be dulled pretty consistently, and overall it got loose a whole lot where we had to keep tightening on the nut. The guard, which in reviews often seemed to be the favorite out of Cold Steel versus Hanwei, the guard is extremely dented after a couple months, and yeah, it's a weak guard, really floppy and weak sword. None of us ever liked using it, and it's not a sword that we'd ever recommend using. And I only got this maybe just a bit over a year ago, so it is probably their newer version. Another one that someone I know got was also very bendy, and it's likely their new style is making the floppier sword and weak guard. So the next sword, this is the Hanwei blade with a different guard on it. So I'll explain that in a bit. The blade for the Hanwei is quite short. I wouldn't call it a saber, I would call it something closer to a hanger or cutlass, and it's just going to be outranged by a lot of stuff, but it's at least a stiff enough blade that it's perfectly good amount of flex. It's going to bend on the thrust a good amount, but it's not compromising the blade's usability. It does have an even sharper tip than the Cold Steel, and it's pointed, it's triangular, so it does have to have a blunt on it. The base guard on it did survive longer, and the handle was pretty much the same as Cold Steel's. It would spin in the hand with gloves, and is just not a good handle. So this is a Castille Armoury guard for their economy saber with a homemade handle put onto it. We just drilled sections for each size and then put it on tight, and just a couple nuts at the end, and overall made a very good hanger or cutlass that teaches you about hand protection and also is very fast and mobile and is a usable HEMA blade. This is the Castile economy saber, so it is very thin blade. The tip is, for us in general, safe enough. It is not something that we would use in a competitive environment, but it's at least good enough for practicing. It does bend a good amount, but definitely not an over amount of flex. The problem that we had was the handle was actually not the right shape as the tang inside, and so it would shift and it cracked and kept rotating in the hand even if we tightened it, and it was getting too big of a problem. The person who owns this saber, this Eduardo saber, he wanted more hand protection, so we decided to switch, and same thing as before, we made a handle, just drilling out different sections at different sizes. The Castille Armoury saber also is a bit different of a weight feeling because it doesn't have a pommel at all. So it is still a good enough weight, but is just a little bit awkward, but it's overall very light, that it doesn't affect your handling. But it is a lighter sword, so if you're wanting to practice something that involves a heavier sword, this might not be the best choice, although it's a good sword for starting off, especially for the price. This guard fared a lot better than the Castile one. It does have a couple cracks in it where cuts have landed on the edge, but it's still stayed intact. It hasn't fully dented in. There's a couple bigger dents in it. And how we do the handles, I do it like my hockey sticks. If you don't practice hockey, then this might be a helpful thing for you to know. We start with the long piece of tape. We spin it around so it's a wire, and then we wrap it around the handle, and then we tape over it, resulting in a very good grip for a sword blade. So this is my steel saber. It's made by Castille Armoury. I want something that was heavier and was for cutting. And so I picked the biggest blade and the lightest guard. That way there is more impact in the blade. And it feels very nice. It is definitely hefty and gets a bit of workout for the arm, but it doesn't strain the wrist like one of the synthetic swords, and feels very, very comfortable in the hand. It just feels like a super nice saber. I really like Castile. The tip is flared out a little bit more than the economy one, so it's good enough for what we do here in a tournament. I'd always blunt that. And apparently you can just buy different blades and they'll all fit. So at some point I might buy the lighter blade from Castile just to use as a lighter saber for tournament, because this is quite a heavier sword. If people have a lot of light swords and are very fast, I could easily get overwhelmed. That's a bonus for going with Castile. Everything's interchangeable. It loosens very rarely, maybe once a month, and it's just a tiny bit of loosening. And so I just twisted it maybe a couple millimeters again, and it's good to go for another month. It bends a good amount, and I was very, very happy with Castile and their saber. So I'd highly recommend Castile. A steel saber that I've been wanting to try out is the Easton saber from Cavite, and if you haven't heard of that, you can check out reviews and see that. It looks like a very nice saber. But for North America, Castile is my favorite brand to go with.